All right. Well, I'm gonna pop my screen up here. Just Carlo, if you don't mind, give me a thumbs up that it looks all right on your side.
Yes, perfect.
All right, great. All right. Well, I promised Carlo I'd pull out some of my Italian to start off. So, buongiorno, mi chiamo Garrison Draper. Mi scusi, non parlo italiano molto bene. And because of that, I'm going to shift back over to my English because it's going to sound a lot more intelligent that way. But I couldn't leave Carlo hanging to figure out how good my Italian was. So today I'm really hoping to build a little bit on the presentation I actually gave at Steve Barrett's conference a couple of weeks ago. And it was a really, really great conference. And I think one of the really great pieces about it was that each of each of the presentations sort of built on each other, or throughout the day there were different presentations that sort of led to interesting pieces for the next one. So it was a really fun one. So I'm actually going to use a very similar presentation and talk about some of the new ideas that we've developed even within this unfortunate break with COVID-19, because there have been some positives on the research side and some really great times to have a thought when a lot of times we're all running around as craziness. So before I get started, I really wanted to say thank you to everyone who's been a big part of it. There's a few people I need to call out directly, and that's the Philadelphia Union. They give me a lot of opportunities within my work to do some cool research and to make a lot of really great insights. And so without them, none of this would be possible. And then inside of the Philadelphia Union, in particular, our performance department, our medical team, and our strength and conditioning and sports science teams, they end up doing a lot of the legwork for me, which is great. And I couldn't do this without them. So thank you to those guys. To Carlo and the Cambiodicampo team, thank you for putting this together. This is a really cool event, and I'm really excited to dig through some of the presentations that actually happened while I was still sleeping this morning. And then finally, my advisory team at Teesside University, Greg Atkinson, Paul Chesterton, and Matt Wright. They're great, and they spend a lot of time questioning my thought processes and is also really guiding my ideas. My last little caveat before I get into the fun stuff: if it sounds like Godzilla is attacking Philadelphia, have no fears. It's not Godzilla or a dinosaur. It's my 11-month-old, and he's really not enjoying napping this morning. So if you hear that, just ignore it. I promise he'll go back to sleep. He's usually a good sleeper. All right, so just to talk a little bit about my project and sort of where it came from, the topic actually started out as trying to figure out ways to utilize our current data and create metrics that combine internal and external training loads, to sort of give a one measure approach and really help sports scientists and at the higher level coaching staffs make decisions on that data and be able to leverage it. And as we were going through, my advisory team, Greg Atkinson, Matt, Paul, they started having a think about just the circumstances that we're in here at the Philadelphia Union. And one of them is the extreme environmental challenges that we run into. And it became interesting. And we saw through a lot of our data that there were some really interesting environmental factors and some different contextual variables that came into play throughout the data set. So we sort of said, yes, maybe as an end result, we create some metrics, but let's really dive into these environmental contexts and figure out what's happening. And so some of the main purposes of this project and this presentation are to sort of show you the processes that we went through. And one of them was to continually evaluate our current practices. And one of the big goals of this project was not to create more data or create new devices or new ways to collect data, but it was to repurpose data, information that most of us at the elite level already collect on a regular basis, and leverage it to make other decisions or to understand different pieces of the process. And then finally, as you'll see in a couple of slides, coming up, understand the effects of the environmental conditions. And this is a direct problem that we've run into in the MLS specifically, um, and how it sort of change and look at how these environmental conditions actually change the physical load and the perceived loads during training and games. So, to give you a little more context of why this question came up, the MLS is a very, very large physical league. When we look at the size of the league itself, you can have flights that last over 6.5 hours. Um, the flight from Philadelphia to Los Angeles is about 2,389 miles. It takes about 6.25 hours to get there. Um, so it's a vast country, and there's some really interesting challenges that come from that, like you'll see in Australia and some of the other larger countries. But we felt this was a really interesting way to leverage some of our data, and a really interesting example of some of the environmental conditions that you might encounter. One of them being, the city of Houston is down in the southern point of the United States in Texas. And what we encountered one time when we played in Houston, we played in the middle of July, during the warmest part of our season. And at, at noon on the day of our game, it was 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And so there's some extreme conditions that we have to deal with. If we go up into some of the Rocky Mountains, we have Salt Lake City and Colorado, which are at moderate altitude zones. And so dealing with some of the physiologic changes of altitude can really affect the way that athletes perform, at least anecdotally. And we actually did some research and dug into it a little bit more to find that, yes, there are some changes in the way that athletes perform and perceive this. Then finally, another really big challenge, and it's sort of I guess, an offspring of the challenges of the NBA and NHL, which play every couple of nights, and they have, and in their schedule, it's sort of been built in that they might fly across country. Now, in the MLS, we even encounter that, even though we as athletes might cover 10 to 13,000 meters during a match, there's still times where we might fly from Philadelphia to Montreal, back to Philadelphia, out to San Jose, California, back to Philadelphia, and then to Columbus, Ohio. And those three examples were actually all performed within 7 days of each other. That was a Saturday, Wednesday, Saturday fixture set that we encountered during a season. So these challenges are real and they're very difficult. And for us as practitioners, it's really important that we better understand how to mitigate them and also how to prepare athletes for them. So we talk about the challenges of road games, but why not just focus on the home games? A quick analysis we did of the league over a 4 or 5 year span was that road games and consistent road success are actually very important into making the playoffs and getting better seeds in the MLS playoffs. And what we found was it only really takes 0.91 points per game to ensure yourself a playoff spot. That's also sort of leaning on the fact that you do well at home, but 0.91 points per game was sort of a number that we found was one that consistently got you into the playoffs. And 3 wins on the road, that's all it took. So focusing on some of these wins and getting points on the road when you can was a really important piece to success. The other big challenge with the MLS is some of our roster rules and some of our spending rules really limit the quality across the roster spot. And so the concept that always comes up is squad rotation. And this is an analysis actually from last year, and this includes all of the competitions. This is playoffs, the MLS season, and the US Open Cup or the Canadian Cup, depending on which country the team is in. But what we found was the top teams, LAFC, for example, was the best team in the history of the league. Their top 14 players played 90% of their minutes. And so squad rotation really isn't something that's been deemed successful in our league. And what we also found is that these values here, the percentage of minutes played by your top 14 players, had a 0.75 R value with points at the end of the season. So there was a very strong correlation between the number of points you finish with at the end of the year and the percentage of minutes played by your top 14 players. And so what we want to do here is make sure that with our processes and with our advice, we're also preparing our athletes for these environmental conditions because our top players are very important. So one of the projects that we first got started on when we started sort of discovering that road games and travel and the environmental context could be really important is actually from Robertson and Joyce's paper on rugby league. Yes, it was rugby league. And what they did was they actually created a game difficulty index. And so they took different variables that were important to them in their world and created a score for every game that they played in. We did a very similar context, but we actually took environmental conditions into play here to try and guide our decision-making processes. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, our game difficulty index did not correlate with our results for that season. So some of our hardest games, we actually got points in, and some of our easiest games, we did not get points in. But I don't look at that as a bad thing. I think that means that when we identified a difficult game, we took steps to alleviate that stress and help our athletes succeed. And so I think some of our practices were actually successful, which is a really great sign that by mitigating some of these environmental difficulties, we actually could see some improved performances. So that was actually the stepping stone of our project here. And this is something that we do every year in our league is take the schedule and begin assigning scores. And we do this for every team in the league to understand where they're coming from as well. So if we play them maybe on a Wednesday, we can start looking at what are some of the stressors that they've encountered over the last couple of weeks, which is actually a really great building block into the actual project itself. Before we get into the actual project, I'll just give you a really quick look at some of the data sets that we're utilizing as we go through this process. As it comes to where the player interactions are, a lot of our screening processes haven't been pulled into this research project yet, but I have a feeling over the next couple of months, those will also be included because I think it's really important that we start being able to be prescriptive based on responses to this. Player wellness and differential RPE. Steve Barrett just talked a little bit about their use of differential RPE, and we've found some really great insight from that measure as well. I'd encourage you to dig into a little bit because I think there are some really great utilizations of it. And obviously some of our physical and objective measures from heart rate, catapult, and then also in game we have optical tracking through Chiron Hago and Second Spectrum. So there's a lot of really interesting data pieces that come in to really guide our decision making here. Just to zoom in a little bit more, a major piece of this project is actually a subjective side because we feel that it's really important not only to get the objective pieces of what the athletes are doing, but that perceptive side is also an important piece because the psychology really drives the physiology of performance. And so the more we understand about how the athlete is feeling, the better we can help them either get ready to perform or guide them maybe away from specific types of work. And so these are actually screenshots of our wellness survey and our differential RPE surveys that the players interact with every day. You can sort of see the questions that we utilized, or a few of the questions we utilize, also how they can get a look at the scale and understand what we're asking them. So to dive into the project a little bit more, this is currently unpublished research. We're working on getting it into a journal shortly, but this was really the first paper of the project, and it's a big guiding factor for us into the usefulness of this work, but also really gave us a couple of stepping stones in the process. And so there were a couple of big purposes to this paper. The first one was we wanted to see how efficient our data collection was. Did we need to ask all the questions we did with our subjective information, and what was actually useful? And so we actually ran a principal component analysis and found there to be actually, out of the 8 questions, only 3 major components. So there was some overlap and some questions that we could probably eliminate from the survey. So we actually dropped it down into there's essentially 3 questions that we should be asking. There's the physical load, which equated to soreness in our wellness survey. There's the psychological load or psychological perception of load, which equated to mood. And then there was sort of a lifestyle, which equated to our hydration question. And hydration and nutrition actually lined up directly. So either one of those 2 questions would have worked out just fine in this analysis. But we were able to drop down our wellness survey to 3 questions, which is always part of the goal is how many times can we limit the interaction and how many times can we limit the asks that we have of our athletes, which I think is always important, and being efficient and not taking too much, which was a big goal of this project. Again, instead of asking more out of our athletes, we're actually asking more out of our data. So what we found in this project was if we just look at the overall, so the filled in circles, that's the entire data set combined. And what we found was that there were small to moderate or trivial to moderate correlations between the next day wellness. So we actually took wellness, asked it on Monday morning, but it actually reflected the Sunday's response. So we used Monday's wellness question survey to compare Sunday's game data, for example. And what we found were these trivial to moderate relationships between a couple of our external and internal training load values. But then what we decided to do was let's add a little more context to our data. So we split the data set. We looked at in-season and preseason subgroups. And what we found was this in-season period, which had many more of the troughs and valleys of loading between games, which could constitute up to 40% of our weekly training load, 40 to 50% of our weekly training load, depending on the week, and our recovery days, which could be less than 6% of our weekly training load. We found some very moderate to strong correlations between this next day wellness measure and some of our external and internal load variables. This was a very positive thing for us because it showed that the context was really important and also that it was sensitive to the extremes in load. And there's a really interesting paper about, I believe it was women's World Cup qualifying. And what they found was wellness may not be sensitive enough to track the small changes in variation, but what we showed was we were able to see some of the larger changes based on this larger spectrum of load, which is always an exciting thing to find. So as we dug into some of our more environmental context, we knew that the context was really important for our data. And so we continue to sort of ask those questions of it and continually sort of wanted to figure out how can we utilize this data that we already collect and guide our decision making. So what we found here was as we looked at, this is a 2-week period for our athletes, and at sea level, we found that in the differential RPE measures, legginess typically was the same or above our breathlessness score during the differential RPE. As we shifted into an altitude period, where we were at altitude for, it was 3 training sessions and a single match. So it was 4 sleeps, essentially. What we found was it was one of the only times in the data set where breathlessness actually went above legginess. And you'll see actually in heat, it happens again. But this was one of the strongest times where that ratio actually shifted a little bit. And that's even with this bar or the line here is our wellness. So wellness really didn't change when we were at altitude or at sea level. That stayed fairly consistent. But the response to the load really changed. And so that really guided us to say, all right, if we start looking at the physiology of altitude, what happens when we go up to altitude? Where is this interacting with the physiology? How is our data responding to what's happening internally? Obviously, the hyperventilation could be one of those major factors. And also our body's sort of attempt to reduce lactate built up from the increase in altitude, there's a couple of different places that we really felt this could be explaining it. And so we felt the differential RPE was very valid and a useful measure in a lot of our environmental contexts. So this was a really great step for us in sort of making decisions on how do we prepare for altitude, what are the types of training recommendations we might make, and also from a travel side, how might we better um, help our athletes in getting used to that. And one of the big things that we found that wasn't so much reflected so easily in this graph here, but it was that that ratio started to come closer together between the legginess and breathlessness um, the longer we spent at altitude. So sort of along the recommendations that we already know about altitude and is reflected now by this data is that the more time you spend at altitude, probably the better we're able to help our athletes in preparing for that competition. So then another context that we encounter a lot, and even Philadelphia, where our home stadium is, can get very hot during the summer. There's been days of 97, 98 degree Fahrenheit at kickoff. So this is a challenge that we don't just incur when we're traveling to Houston or Texas or Florida, but it's also something we incur when we're at home during the summer months. And what we found was just with our physical performance data, there were some relationships with temperature. And what we found was high speed running sort of had a big drop off as we started to get warmer and warmer. Work rate really had a big drop off as we started to get warmer and warmer. And actually, with high speed running efforts, there was sort of like a hot spot for it, where there was a sort of a U-shaped curve where we know there's sort of an optimal where it needs to be a certain temperature to allow for optimal performance. But if it gets too hot, then there's sort of a change there. So again, that really guided us in our decision-making processes of let's look at the physiology. What's happening now from this side? And there's a lot of different points from the physiology of heat that really guided our decision making and helped us make decisions in the travel and training processes to aid our athletes. Obviously, we saw increases in RPE, which is reflected in our survey results. There's a change in the way we utilize glycogen and glucose. And so a lot of our recommendations from this side sort of shift towards that, and the way that we may prepare our menus or the way that we may prepare some of our hydration tactics are really based on the physiology and reflected in that data. So we're really trying to connect those two data sets together to really guide our decision making. Not as important in Italian football because the country is fairly small compared to the United States, but I've always felt that some of our airline travel and our wellness data um, connects really well. And so I just want to give you some really interesting insight into sort of what we found. And that's the amount of time we spent on an airplane had some really good correlation and connection with our wellness data. And that's next day wellness data. So we're looking at after getting off an airplane, how does our body perceive it and how do our athletes perceive that information? Each of these lines represents an individual. So you can see it's a very individualized response to that load. And it is load, it's a stressor. And so what we found was actually our athletes that have been in the league for 2 or more years sort of have this normal, there's a slight change. Obviously, it's difficult when we look at airline travel in general. The altitude inside the cabin is similar to being at Machu Picchu, which is considered an extreme altitude environment. And the humidity of the cabin is similar to being in a desert. So there's very low humidity, not great for our recovery and our performance. So these are things that we really need to look into. But what was interesting is this line here, this really steep green one, that represents a player that was new to our team and new to our league. And the struggles that these players incurred as they were new in our league were very interesting. And they're things that we need to sort of help them make decisions on throughout the process and warn them and prepare them for, but then also on the physiologic side, manage the recovery processes. Sort of last contextual thing that we're really looking at is time zone shifting, which again, in a lot of European leagues, you don't encounter on a regular basis unless you're in Champions League. But what we're finding is As we get further away from our home time zone would be represented by 0. There is a change in wellness. And what we found was for every 0.75 hours shifted, there was a 0.36 change in wellness. And so for our athletes that are going 3 time zones, when we go to the West Coast to play LA or Seattle or Portland, what we're expecting to see is a whole point's worth of wellness. And that's an important question for us in our research later, which is what is important in our changes in wellness, what reflects change, and how do we navigate that decision making. So that'll probably be a project that comes up sooner rather than later in our thought processes. Good. So as always, we're always looking at what's next. Obviously, the importance of how much change is important. That minimum worthwhile change is always something that we're going to be looking at from a wellness and differential RPE perspectives. And then also the dose response relationship is always going to be an interesting one. So we can really guide and prescribe our training from there. Great. I really appreciate the time. If you have questions or want to talk more, my contact information is here. I love my Twitter. Carlo found that I also am pretty decent at checking my LinkedIn. So please utilize all those. And I hope everyone stays safe. I know we're about to start some of our individual training on Monday, which is really exciting for us. So everyone, I wish you the best, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you, Garrison. Thanks for the presentation. There are a lot of differences from what we normally see in Europe, but there are a lot of things we should think about, and to have a wider perspective of football and what's going on also in the world, because Major League Soccer is getting bigger and faster and more technical every day. I've seen some matches, and they're really different from what they were some years ago. So thanks for your presentation.